On August 28, 2002, Toronto Markkey Patterson was strapped to a gurney in the death chamber at the Wiginton Unit in Huntsville, Texas. He was 24 years old. He had spent 7 years on death row, waiting for this moment since he was 17. In a few minutes, the state of Texas would execute him for murders he committed as a juvenile. At 6 p.m. Central Time, prison officials began the lethal injection. 3 drugs flowed through IV lines into his arms. The first put him to sleep. The second paralyzed his muscles. The third stopped his heart. Witnesses watched through glass as the chemicals did their work. Family members of his victims sat in silence. They had waited 7 years for this day. At 6:20 p.m., a doctor checked for a pulse and found none. Toronto Markkey Patterson was pronounced dead. His final statement lasted several minutes. He apologized for the pain he had caused. He said he felt responsibility and guilt. But even strapped to the gurney, even with death minutes away, he insisted he should not die for a crime he did not commit. He asked for forgiveness. He said he was at peace. Then he did something no one expected. He invited everyone to his funeral. He said they were all still family. His last words were for his mother, his aunt, and his loved ones. He told them he loved them. Then he turned to the warden and said 3 final words: "I am ready." Patterson was the 13th person Texas executed for crimes committed as a juvenile since the death penalty returned in 1976. He was the 21st such execution in the entire United States. Of the 19 juvenile offenders put to death nationwide during that period, 11 came from Texas. The state led the nation in executing children. Less than 3 years later, the United States Supreme Court would rule that executing juvenile offenders violated the Constitution. The practice Toronto Patterson died for would be declared cruel and unusual punishment. 72 people on death rows across America would have their sentences reduced to life in prison. 29 of them were in Texas. If Toronto's execution had been delayed, he might have been among them. But on August 28, 2002, that ruling had not yet come. Toronto Patterson would not live to see it. He was executed for crimes that occurred 7 years earlier, on June 6, 1995. A Tuesday afternoon in Dallas, Texas. The city of over 1 million people sprawled across the North Texas plains, baking under the early summer heat. In South Dallas, life moved at its usual pace. Children played in the streets. Adults went to work or looked for work. Drug dealers conducted business on corners, the same as any other day. At some point that afternoon, a 17-year-old walked into a house on the south side of the city. He knew the people inside. They were his family. His cousin Kimberly was relaxing on a recliner. Her 2 children were in a bedroom watching cartoons. 6-year-old Jennifer, 3-year-old Ollie. The 17-year-old pulled out a .38 caliber handgun and shot Kimberly in the head. Then he walked to the bedroom. He shot Jennifer in the head. He found Ollie cowering on a bed with his small hands over his ears, trying to block out the sounds of gunfire. He shot him multiple times. 3 people dead in minutes. Then the 17-year-old went to the garage. He removed 3 wheel rims from a BMW parked inside. He loaded them into his car and drove away, leaving the bodies where they fell. The wheel rims were worth approximately $2,000. 3 lives for $2,000. A mother and 2 small children murdered, so a teenage drug dealer could have nice wheels on his car. Toronto Markkey Patterson was arrested the next day. He confessed to the murders, though he would later claim the confession was beaten out of him. He was tried as an adult. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death at 17 years old. On paper, Toronto Patterson was a monster. A cold-blooded killer who executed 2 small children to eliminate witnesses to a theft. A drug dealer who valued car parts more than human life. The prosecutors called him calculating. They said he knew exactly what he was doing. But there was another story beneath the surface. A story of a boy born into poverty and chaos. A boy whose mother beat him with extension cords. A boy who became the primary caregiver for his baby sister when he was 9 years old, only to watch her die before she turned 2. A boy who was expelled from his home at 15 and taken in by a drug-dealing cousin. A boy failed by every adult and every system that should have protected him. None of that excuses what he did. Nothing can excuse murdering a mother and 2 children for wheel rims. But it helps explain how a child becomes capable of such horror. It helps explain how a 17-year-old could shoot a 3-year-old cowering with his hands over his ears. This is not just a story about murder. This is a story about what we do with young people who commit terrible crimes. This is the story of Toronto Patterson. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. Toronto Markkey Patterson came into the world on October 17, 1977, in Dallas, Texas. His mother, Patricia, was still a teenager herself when she gave birth to him. She was not ready for motherhood. She did not have the emotional tools or financial stability to raise a child. Patricia relied heavily on her own mother to help care for Toronto during his earliest years. The household was poor. Money was always tight. Patricia worked when she could find employment, but steady work was hard to come by in their neighborhood. South Dallas in the late 1970s and 1980s was a community struggling with poverty, crime, and limited opportunities. The streets where Toronto would learn to walk and talk were the same streets where drug dealers conducted their business openly. Violence was common. Gunshots at night were not unusual. Many young men in the neighborhood saw drug dealing as the only path to financial success. Legitimate jobs were scarce, and the ones that existed paid poorly. The crack cocaine epidemic was beginning to take hold across urban America, and South Dallas was not spared. The neighborhood had once been a thriving African-American community with its own businesses and institutions. But decades of economic decline, white flight, and systematic disinvestment had taken their toll. By the time Toronto was growing up, the area was marked by boarded-up buildings, vacant lots, and a sense of hopelessness that pervaded daily life. Patricia Patterson had a temper. When Toronto misbehaved or did something she disapproved of, she would beat him with whatever was within reach. Extension cords became her weapon of choice. She also used sticks and belts. These were not light spankings meant to discipline. These were beatings that left marks on young Toronto's body. The abuse was frequent and severe. Toronto learned early that home was not always a safe place. He learned to read his mother's moods, to stay out of her way when she was angry, to make himself small and invisible when the violence began. Despite the violence at home, Toronto did experience love from his grandmother. She provided what stability existed in his young life. She fed him when Patricia could not or would not. She offered comfort when the beatings left him crying. She tried to shield him from the worst of his mother's rages. But even her presence could not fully protect him from the chaos that surrounded him. Drug and alcohol abuse was everywhere in his environment. The adults around him self-medicated to cope with their own traumas and struggles. Bottles and pipes were common sights. The smell of marijuana and crack smoke drifted through apartment hallways. What made Toronto different from many of his peers was that he never touched drugs or alcohol himself. Despite growing up surrounded by substance abuse, he abstained completely. This would be one of the few positive choices he made in his young life. Perhaps he had seen too clearly what drugs did to the adults around him. Perhaps his grandmother's influence kept him away from that particular path of destruction. But abstaining from drugs did not protect him from the other destructive influences in his neighborhood. When Toronto was 9 years old, his mother gave birth to a baby girl named Kenisha. The infant was born with a serious brain defect. She required constant care and medical attention. Patricia Patterson, still struggling with her own demons, was not equipped to handle a special needs child. So the responsibility fell to Toronto. At 9 years old, he became the primary caregiver for his baby sister. Toronto fed Kenisha. He changed her diapers. He held her when she cried. He watched over her while their mother was absent or unavailable. For a child who was still in elementary school, this was an enormous burden. Other children his age were playing outside and focusing on schoolwork. Toronto was learning how to care for an infant with severe medical problems. The weight of this responsibility shaped him in ways that would only become clear later. He missed school to care for his sister. He sacrificed his own childhood to keep her alive. Kenesha's condition was serious. Her brain defect meant she would never develop normally. She required more care than the family could realistically provide. Medical bills piled up. The stress in the household intensified. Patricia's temper grew worse. The beatings continued. Toronto found himself caught between being a child and being a parent to his own sister. He resented the burden at times. What 9-year-old would not? But he also loved Kenesha fiercely. She was his baby sister, and he was determined to keep her safe. The healthcare system offered little help. Before Kenesha reached her 2nd birthday, she died. The loss devastated Toronto. He had spent nearly 2 years of his childhood caring for this baby. He had loved her despite the burden she represented, and now she was gone. The grief he experienced was profound. He had tried so hard to keep her alive. He had sacrificed so much, and none of it had been enough. The failure haunted him, but there was no counseling, no therapy. No adults helping him process this trauma. He was expected to simply move on. Toronto did not move on. The death of Kenesha left a wound that never properly healed. He became more withdrawn. His performance in school declined. He started getting into fights with other children. By the time Toronto reached 15, he could no longer stay in his mother's house. Patricia expelled him. The exact circumstances of his removal from the home are unclear, but the result was definitive. Toronto was on his own at 15 years old. He had no money. He had no job skills. He had no high school diploma. What he did have was a cousin named Vernon Stiff, who was willing to take him in. Being expelled from home at 15 is a traumatic experience under any circumstances. For Toronto, it represented both an ending and a beginning. The ending was whatever remained of his childhood. The beginning was his full entry into the world of adults, a world for which he was completely unprepared. He had no legitimate means of supporting himself. He could not legally work most jobs. He had nowhere to go, except to people who were willing to take him in. And the person willing to take him in was a drug dealer. Vernon Stiff was a drug dealer. He made his living selling cocaine on the streets of Dallas. When Toronto moved in with Vernon, he was immediately exposed to the drug trade in a direct way. This was not the peripheral exposure he had experienced growing up. This was hands-on education in how to make money illegally. Vernon showed Toronto the business, the suppliers, the customers, the territories, the prices, the risks, and Toronto proved to be an eager student. He had always been intelligent. Now that intelligence was being channeled into criminal enterprise. Within months, Toronto was dealing drugs himself. He started making $500 to $700 per day. For a 15-year-old who had grown up in poverty, this was life-changing money. He could buy things he had never been able to afford. He could eat at restaurants. He could wear nice clothes. The money gave him a sense of power and independence he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was somebody. He felt like he mattered. The streets respected him because he had money. And money, in his world, was the only thing that mattered. Toronto dropped out of high school during his sophomore year. Education seemed pointless when he was making more money than his teachers. The streets had become his classroom. The drug trade had become his career. He was still a child, but he was living like an adult. He had his own money, his own schedule, and his own rules. Or so he believed. In reality, the drug trade was setting him on a path toward destruction. The easy money came with risks that a 15-year-old could not fully appreciate. The money brought new desires. Toronto developed an obsession with expensive chrome and gold wheel rims. In mid-1990s Dallas, fancy rims were status symbols. They announced to the world that you had made it. A set of premium wheels could cost $3,000 to $4,000. In 1995, Dallas was experiencing what some called an epidemic of wheel-related violence. At least 9 people were killed that year alone over fancy wheels. Toronto put expensive rims on his own car. He took pride in them. They represented everything he had achieved since leaving his mother's house. But this obsession with wheels would eventually lead him down a path of destruction that would cost 4 lives, including his own. Before June 1995, there were warning signs that Toronto Patterson was capable of serious violence. School officials documented several concerning incidents. On one occasion, Toronto wore gang colors to school in violation of the dress code. When confronted, he became aggressive. He refused to change. He challenged the authority of school officials. On another occasion, school authorities confiscated his beeper. Beepers were commonly used by drug dealers to communicate with customers. Toronto threatened to kill them for taking it. These threats were documented but did not result in serious intervention. No one called his home. No one referred him to counseling. The threats were noted and filed away. There was also an incident involving a firearm. Toronto fired a Mac-12 weapon at a friend. The Mac-12 was a compact submachine gun popular among drug dealers for its concealability and firepower. The circumstances surrounding this shooting are unclear, but the fact remained that Toronto had access to automatic weapons and was willing to use them. He was charged with possession of a weapon, but the charge was eventually dismissed. The drug dealing continued without interruption. Toronto sold cocaine to an FBI informant. This should have resulted in serious legal consequences. It should have been a wake-up call. Federal drug charges could have sent him to prison for years. Instead, Toronto continued operating as if he were untouchable. The money kept flowing, the lifestyle continued, and the violence simmering inside him remained unaddressed. Every encounter with the legal system that did not result in serious consequences reinforced his belief that he was above the law. In April 1995, someone stole the chrome and gold rims from Toronto's car. This theft enraged him beyond reason. Those rims represented his success. They represented his status in the community. Having them stolen felt like a personal violation. It was an attack on everything he had built since being expelled from his mother's house. Toronto became obsessed with replacing them. But the rims were expensive. Even with his drug money, buying a new set would take time. He needed wheels now. He needed to restore his image immediately. Toronto knew that his cousin Vernon Stiff had a BMW with expensive chrome and gold rims. Vernon was currently in prison and could not use the car. The BMW was stored at the home of Vernon's mother, Evelyn Stiff. Toronto's cousin Kimberly Brewer lived at that house along with her 2 young children. Toronto began thinking about those wheels. He knew exactly where they were. He knew he could take them. The only problem was that people would be home. People who knew him. People who could identify him. Toronto began planning. He weighed his options, and in early June 1995, he made his decision. He would take those wheels, and he would eliminate anyone who could connect him to the theft. The person most likely to be home when he arrived was Kimberly, his own cousin, a young mother with 2 small children. Toronto knew her. He had known her his entire life. Kimberly Brewer had no idea that she had become a target. She had no idea that her own cousin was planning her death. She went about her days caring for her children, managing the household, living the ordinary life of a young mother in South Dallas. She was 25 years old in June 1995. Kimberly was a young mother trying to make her way in the world. She had 2 children she was raising. She lived at the home of Evelyn Stiff, where she helped with household responsibilities while caring for her kids. Life was not glamorous, but it was stable. She had a roof over her head. Her children were safe. She was making it work. By all accounts, Kimberly was a devoted mother. Her children were her priority. She made sure they were fed, clothed, and loved. Life was not easy for a young single mother in their neighborhood, but Kimberly did what she needed to do. She had hopes for the future. She had dreams for her children. She wanted them to have opportunities she never had. She wanted them to go to school, to graduate, to make something of themselves. She was determined to break the cycle of poverty and struggle that had defined her own life. Kimberly's days revolved around her children. 6-year-old Jennifer and 3-year-old Ollie needed constant attention. Kimberly knew Toronto. They were family. When he showed up at the house, she had no reason to be afraid. He was her cousin, someone she had known since childhood. She welcomed him inside. She had no idea that he had come with a specific purpose in mind. She did not know about his obsession with the wheel rims stored in the garage. She did not know the danger that had just walked through her door. She saw only Toronto, family, someone who deserved hospitality and trust. The morning of June 6, 1995, began like any other day for Toronto Patterson. He was staying with his girlfriend at her house. Between 10 and 11 in the morning, he told her he was leaving to go to physical therapy for a back injury. This was partially true. He did have a therapy appointment. But he also had other plans. Plans he had been formulating since his wheels were stolen in April. Plans that would end with 3 people dead. Kimberly had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. After the visit, Toronto left to attend his physical therapy appointment. This was calculated. It would give him an alibi. He could prove he was at therapy during certain hours. If anyone asked where he was, he could point to medical records showing his attendance. After his appointment ended, he drove back to the Stiff residence. This time, he came with a different purpose. He brought a .38 caliber handgun with him. He had made his decision. There would be no witnesses. What happened next took place quickly. Kimberly Brewer was sitting on a recliner in the living area. Toronto approached her and shot her in the head from approximately 3 feet away. She died instantly or within moments. There was no struggle, no chance for her to fight back. But Kimberly was not alone in the house. Her 2 children were there. 6-year-old Jennifer and 3-year-old Ollie had witnessed their mother being shot. Toronto Patterson now faced a choice. He could leave immediately and hope the children could not identify him, or he could eliminate the witnesses. He chose to eliminate the witnesses. He chose to murder 2 children rather than risk being identified. He chose wheel rims over the lives of a 6-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy. Jennifer Brewer was in a bedroom when Toronto Patterson found her. The 6-year-old was on the floor, still in the room where she had been watching cartoons. She was just a child in her own home, in a place where she should have been completely safe. In a place where no child should ever have to fear for her life. Toronto shot Jennifer in the head. He fired from close range, approximately 3 feet away. The bullet ended her life instantly. She never had a chance to run. She never had a chance to hide. She never had a chance to scream for help. 3-year-old Ollie Brown Jr. was in a bed in the same room. When Toronto approached him, Ollie was cowering with his hands over his ears. He understood that something terrible was happening. He was trying to protect himself the only way a toddler knows how. His small hands covered his ears, perhaps to block out the sounds of gunfire. Perhaps he thought if he could not hear it, it would not be real. Toronto shot Ollie multiple times. In a matter of minutes, Toronto Patterson had murdered 3 people. His 25-year-old cousin, her 6-year-old daughter, her 3-year-old son. All 3 were shot in the head with a .38 caliber handgun. All 3 died in their own home. And the RIA. With 3 bodies now in the house, Toronto Patterson went to the garage. Vernon Stiff's BMW was parked there, exactly where Toronto knew it would be. The chrome and gold rims that had motivated these murders were still attached to the vehicle. Toronto got to work removing them. He successfully removed 3 of the 4 rims. The 4th rim would not come off. Despite his efforts, he could not detach it from the wheel. The lug nuts were stuck. Eventually, he gave up on the 4th rim and left with the 3 he had managed to take. He loaded them into his grandmother's car and drove away from the scene of his crimes. 3 rims. 3 lives. He had not even been able to complete the theft that had motivated the murders. Toronto drove back to his girlfriend's house. It was now between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. When he arrived, his girlfriend noticed that something was wrong. He appeared scared and out of breath. He was not behaving normally. He quickly changed his clothes. The clothes he had been wearing during the murders were covered in blood. They needed to be hidden. They were evidence that could connect him to the crime. Toronto told his girlfriend what he had done. He admitted that he had shot someone and stolen the wheel rims. She was now complicit in his crime through her knowledge. The bloody clothing was left at her house. The stolen rims were placed in her garage. She did not call the police. She did not report what Toronto had told her. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or shock, she kept his secret, at least for a while. In the days that followed, Toronto tried to sell the stolen rims. He went to a place called Aycock Tire and Wheel, but he was unsuccessful in finding a buyer. Perhaps the seller seemed suspicious. The June heat was rising, time was passing, and someone was about to walk into a nightmare. Valerie Brewer had not heard from her sister Kimberly. This was unusual. The two sisters talked regularly. They checked in on each other. They shared the burdens of life as young women in South Dallas. When Kimberly did not answer her phone, Valerie grew concerned. When hours passed with no response, concern turned to worry. Valerie decided to go to the Stiff residence and check on her sister in person. She had no idea what awaited her on the other side of that door. When Valerie entered the house, the smell hit her first. Then the silence. A house with two small children is never silent. There should have been noise. Cartoons playing, children laughing or arguing, Kimberly calling out instructions. Instead, there was nothing. Valerie called her sister's name. No answer. She moved through the house, her heart beginning to race. She found Kimberly in the living room, slumped on a recliner, a gunshot wound in her head. The horror of what she was seeing did not register at first. Her mind rejected it. This could not be real. This could not be her sister. Then Valerie remembered the children. Jennifer, Ollie. Where were the children? She ran to the bedroom, praying she would find them hiding, scared but alive. Instead, she found them exactly where Toronto Patterson had left them. Jennifer was on the floor, shot in the head. Ollie was in the bed, his small body bearing multiple gunshot wounds. 3 members of her family had been executed in their own home. Her sister, her niece, her nephew, all dead, all murdered. The screams that came from Valerie Brewer brought neighbors running from their houses. Valerie immediately called the police. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial. Officers from the Dallas Police Department arrived at the scene within minutes. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a drug deal turned violent. This was something else entirely. The crime scene investigation began. Detectives processed the house, collecting evidence and documenting everything they found. They photographed the bodies from every angle. They collected shell casings from the floor. They dusted for fingerprints on every surface. They looked for any evidence that might lead them to the killer. The garage was examined. They discovered that 3 rims were missing from the BMW parked inside. 1 rim remained attached because it could not be removed. This told investigators that the killer had come for the wheels. This was not a random act of violence. This was a theft that had turned into a triple homicide. Someone had murdered a mother and 2 children for car parts. Valerie Brewer had a suspicion almost immediately. Even through her grief, even through her shock, her mind was working. She knew that Toronto Patterson's own wheel rims had been stolen recently. She knew he was obsessed with expensive wheels. She knew he was aware that Vernon's BMW was stored at the house. The wheels were missing. Toronto wanted wheels. The connection was obvious to her. When she told detectives about Toronto, they had their first real lead. A family member pointing at another family member. It happens more often than people want to believe. The people most likely to kill us are the people who know us best. But there was another person of interest. Ollie Brown Jr., the father of the 2 murdered children, arrived at the crime scene at almost the same time as the paramedics. His timing was unusual. How did he know to come? How did he arrive so quickly? Police tested his hands for gunshot residue. The results showed levels of antimony and barium consistent with someone who had recently discharged a firearm. A polygraph test was administered. The results were inconclusive, but leaned toward deception. Here was a man with gunshot residue on his hands, failing a polygraph, arriving at the crime scene at a suspicious time. However, once police focused on Toronto, the investigation of Ollie Brown ceased. On the evening of June 6, 1995, after killing 3 people, Toronto Patterson did something that would later shock investigators. He returned to the crime scene. Not to check on his victims. Not out of guilt or remorse. He went back to watch. Criminologists have long noted that some killers return to the scenes of their crimes. They come back to relive the experience. They come back to see the reaction. They come back because something compels them to witness the aftermath of what they have done. By evening, the stiff residence had become a hub of police activity. Yellow crime scene tape surrounded the property. Officers and detectives moved in and out. Neighbors had gathered to watch. The flashing lights of police cars illuminated the street. News crews had arrived with their cameras and satellite trucks. The murders of a woman and 2 children drew significant media attention. This was not a routine drug killing. This was something that shocked even a city accustomed to violence. Toronto brought his girlfriend with him. They stood in the crowd of onlookers, watching as the bodies of Kimberly, Jennifer, and Ollie were removed from the house. Body bags carried out one by one, the small bags that held the children, the larger bag that held their mother. Family members wept openly, neighbors comforted each other, and Toronto Patterson stood there, observing it all. He did not approach family members to offer comfort. He did not appear to be grieving. He simply stood there, watching. The television news cameras recorded the crowd. They captured Toronto and his girlfriend standing in the background. They were not focused on them specifically. The cameras were documenting the scene, capturing the grief of family members, recording the police activity. But Toronto and his girlfriend were clearly visible in the footage. Later, when investigators obtained this tape, they would study it carefully. They would note Toronto's position, his demeanor, his lack of visible emotion. Police quickly focused their investigation on Toronto Patterson. The information from Valerie Brewer about his stolen rims gave them a motive. The missing wheels from the BMW gave them evidence of theft. Everything pointed to Toronto. He had motive. He had opportunity. He had knowledge of where the wheels were stored. Detectives began searching for Toronto and the stolen property. When investigators located the wheel rims, they found them at the house of Toronto's girlfriend. The same girlfriend who had watched him return from the murders, scared and out of breath. The same girlfriend who had helped him hide his bloody clothes. The same girlfriend who had stored the rims in her garage. The same girlfriend who had accompanied him back to the crime scene to watch the bodies being removed. She had kept his secret, but the physical evidence in her possession would betray them both. The rims were processed for evidence. Investigators found Toronto Patterson's fingerprints on them. This was direct physical evidence linking him to the stolen property. The fingerprints proved that Toronto had handled the rims. Combined with the motive information and the girlfriend's potential testimony, police had enough to make an arrest. They had the stolen property, they had fingerprints, they had a witness who knew what Toronto had done. Toronto was also connected to the murders through additional physical evidence. The clothing he had changed out of at his girlfriend's house was recovered. Testing revealed that the clothes were stained with blood. That blood matched the blood of the 3 victims. The DNA evidence was conclusive. Toronto had worn clothing covered in his victim's blood. He had left that clothing at his girlfriend's house, and now that clothing was in police custody. The evidence was overwhelming. On June 7, 1995, one day after the murders, police arrested Toronto Markkey Patterson. He was 17 years old. He was charged with capital murder for the death of 3-year-old Ollie Brown Jr. Under Texas law, killing a child under the age of 6 was a capital offense. It made the defendant eligible for the death penalty regardless of other circumstances. Toronto Patterson now faced the possibility of execution. At 17 years old, he could be sentenced to die for what he had done. Texas was one of the states that allowed the execution of juvenile offenders, and Texas used that option more than any other state in the nation. Detective K.W. Wiginton interrogated Toronto Patterson on the evening of June 7, 1995. The interrogation began at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening. The setting was a small carpeted room at the Dallas police station. What happened in that room over the next several hours would later become the subject of significant controversy. It would raise questions about the reliability of Toronto's confession. It would raise questions about the tactics used by Detective Wiginton. And it would haunt the case through years of appeals. According to Toronto's account, the interrogation began in a friendly manner. Detective Wiginton was calm and conversational at first. He acted like he wanted to help Toronto. He acted like he understood Toronto's situation. But as time passed, the detective's demeanor changed. He became aggressive. He cornered Toronto physically in the small room. He invaded his personal space. According to Toronto, Wiginton spat in his face. He poked and pushed him. The friendly conversation became a physical confrontation. Toronto claimed that Detective Wiginton told him what he had done rather than asking. The detective allegedly said they already had the murder weapon. He claimed they had Toronto's fingerprints on it. These statements were not true. Police did not have the murder weapon. It was never recovered. They did not have Toronto's fingerprints on any gun. These were lies designed to make Toronto believe the case against him was stronger than it actually was. Toronto, a 17-year-old facing capital murder charges, may not have known that police were allowed to lie during interrogations. Toronto asked for an attorney. According to his account, Detective Wiginton told him he could only speak with someone after he confessed. This would be a clear violation of Toronto's constitutional rights under Miranda vs. Arizona. When a suspect requests an attorney, questioning is supposed to stop immediately. The police are supposed to provide access to legal counsel. But according to Toronto, the interrogation continued. His request for an attorney was ignored. The interrogation lasted more than 4 hours. By the end, Toronto had given 2 written confessions. In the first confession, he admitted to stealing the wheels, but claimed he had given them to 2 Jamaican drug dealers who committed the actual murders. He named them as Jamaican Clyde and Jamaican D. When police told him the wheels had been found at his girlfriend's house, contradicting his story about giving them to the Jamaicans, Toronto gave a second confession. In this one, he admitted to killing all 3 victims. He said he walked into the children's room and fired twice with his eyes closed. This detail about closing his eyes would be cited by both sides. The prosecution said it showed he knew what he was doing was wrong. The defense would argue it showed the act of a panicked teenager, not a cold-blooded killer. What makes the Toronto Patterson interrogation even more troubling is what happened 1 month later. Detective K.W. Wiginton, the same detective who extracted confessions from Toronto, interrogated another capital murder suspect named Michael Martinez. Martinez was 21 years old. He was suspected in a different murder case. And Detective Wiginton used the same techniques on him that he had used on Toronto Patterson. Detective Wiginton used similar tactics on Martinez: the aggressive behavior, the physical intimidation, the lies about evidence, the refusal to honor requests for an attorney. And like Toronto, Michael Martinez confessed to a murder. He confessed in detail. He provided information that seemed to prove his guilt. He was charged based largely on that confession. The case seemed closed, but Michael Martinez was innocent. The investigation eventually revealed that another person had committed the crime Martinez confessed to. That other person was identified, arrested, and charged with the murder. Michael Martinez was exonerated. His confession had been false. He had admitted to a crime he did not commit. He had provided false details because Detective Wiginton had fed him information. The entire confession was a fabrication produced by coercive interrogation tactics. Toronto's defense attorneys wanted to present this information to the jury. They wanted jurors to know that Detective Wiginton had a documented history of extracting false confessions. They wanted jurors to question whether Toronto's confession was also coerced and potentially false. If Wiginton could make an innocent man confess to murder, could he not also make a guilty man confess to things he did not do? Could he not have influenced the details of Toronto's confession? This was directly relevant to evaluating the reliability of the evidence. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that this evidence was inadmissible. The court reasoned that allowing jurors to hear about the Martinez case might lead them to believe Detective Wiginton was of questionable character and credibility with respect to interrogating capital murder suspects. This was exactly what the defense wanted jurors to consider. But the court decided they should not hear it. The jury that would decide whether Toronto Patterson lived or died would never know that the detective who obtained his confession had extracted a false confession from an innocent man using the same tactics. They would never know that Detective Wiginton's interrogation methods had been proven to produce unreliable results. Toronto Patterson was indicted on June 23, 1995, in the 5th Criminal District Court of Dallas County. His trial began on November 10, 1995, just 5 months after the murders. The speed was unusual for a capital case. Complex murder cases often take years to come to trial. But Toronto's case moved quickly through the system. The prosecutors handling the case were Assistant District Attorney Jason January and District Attorney George West. Both were experienced in capital cases. Both were determined to secure a death sentence. Toronto pleaded not guilty. His defense maintained that the confessions were coerced and that Jamaican drug dealers had committed the actual murders. He took the stand in his own defense, which was a risky strategy in any murder trial, but especially in a case with this much evidence against him. He told the jury about Detective Wiginton's tactics. He described the physical intimidation. He described the lies about evidence. He maintained that his confession was false, that he had only admitted to the murders because he was scared and confused and believed the police already had proof of his guilt. The prosecution presented a straightforward case. They showed the jury the physical evidence, the fingerprints on the stolen rims, the blood on Toronto's clothing. They presented his confessions. They showed the news footage of him watching the bodies being removed from the house without showing grief. They painted a picture of a cold, calculating killer who murdered 3 people for wheel rims and then returned to the crime scene to admire his work. Prosecutor George West emphasized Toronto's calculated behavior. He told the jury that Toronto had eliminated the children as witnesses. He described it as a conscious decision to increase his odds of not getting caught. The prosecutor argued this showed thought processes inconsistent with a panicked teenager. This showed a cold killer making rational choices. West told the jury that the age of an individual was one thing, but their maturity and experience was another. And this guy was not a dummy. He knew exactly what he was doing. On November 17, 1995, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty of capital murder. Toronto Patterson was convicted of killing 3-year-old Ollie Brown Jr. Although he had killed 3 people, he was tried only for Ollie's murder because killing a child under 6 was the capital offense that allowed prosecutors to seek the death penalty. The guilty verdict meant the trial would proceed to the punishment phase. The jury would now decide whether Toronto Patterson would live or die. After the guilty verdict, the trial moved to the punishment phase. In Texas capital cases, jurors must answer 2 special questions. First, would the defendant probably commit criminal acts of violence that would constitute a continuing threat to society? Second, was there sufficient mitigating evidence to warrant a life sentence rather than death? These questions would determine whether Toronto Patterson received death or life in prison without the possibility of parole. The prosecution presented evidence of Toronto's future dangerousness. They highlighted his history of violence, the threats against school officials, the shooting at a friend with a Mac-12, the drug dealing, the triple murder itself. They argued that a person capable of killing 3 people, including 2 small children, for wheel rims would always be a danger to society. They argued that there was no rehabilitation possible for someone who could murder a 3-year-old cowering with his hands over his ears. The jury answered yes to the first question. They found that Toronto Patterson posed a future danger to society. They answered no to the second question. They found no mitigating circumstances sufficient to spare his life. Based on these answers, the judge had no choice under Texas law. On November 21, 1995, Toronto Patterson was sentenced to death. He was 17 years old. He would be sent to death row to await execution. Toronto's trial attorneys failed to present important mitigating evidence. They did not call experts to testify about juvenile brain development. In 1995, scientific research was already showing that teenage brains are not fully developed. The prefrontal cortex, which controls impulse control and decision-making, does not fully mature until the mid-20s. This means that teenagers are biologically incapable of the same level of judgment as adults. This science was available. It was being discussed in academic journals and at conferences, but it was not presented to the jury. The attorneys also failed to adequately investigate and present Toronto's traumatic childhood. The beatings with extension cords, the burden of caring for his dying baby sister at age 9, the trauma of watching her die, the expulsion from home at 15, the lack of guidance and support from any responsible adult. All of this should have been presented as mitigating evidence to explain, if not excuse, how a 17-year-old could commit such terrible acts. Instead, the jury heard almost nothing about Toronto's background. They made their decision without understanding how a child becomes a killer. Toronto Patterson arrived on death row at 17 years old. He was given prisoner number 9999178. His fellow inmates called him Tonto. Toronto Patterson's case slowly worked its way through the court system over the following years. After a person is convicted and sentenced, they have the right to ask higher courts to review their case. These reviews are called appeals. Toronto's lawyers argued that mistakes were made during his trial. They argued that evidence was wrongly kept from the jury. They argued that his confession was forced. But the courts were not convinced. His first appeal went to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. This is the highest court in Texas for criminal cases. The judges reviewed everything that happened during the trial. They looked at the evidence. They looked at the legal arguments. In January 1999, more than 3 years after Toronto was convicted, the court made their decision. They said the conviction would stand. They said the death sentence would stand. They found nothing wrong with how the trial was conducted. Toronto's first appeal had failed. The next step was something called state habeas corpus. This is a legal process that allows prisoners to challenge their conviction based on problems that were not brought up during the trial. For example, if the trial lawyers did a bad job, this is where that argument would be made. Toronto needed a good lawyer for this stage. Instead, he got Barry Bryant from Texarkana. Barry Bryant had never handled a death penalty appeal before. He had no experience with cases this serious. He did not know what he was doing. And it showed in his work. Bryant filed a 6-page document asking the court to overturn Toronto's conviction. 6 pages. For a case involving 3 murders and a death sentence. Most lawyers in death penalty cases file documents that are dozens or even hundreds of pages long. They spend months investigating. They hire experts. They dig deep into every possible problem with the case. Bryant did none of this. Bryant never looked at the files from Toronto's trial lawyers. He never looked at the files from the prosecutors. He never talked to the lawyers who represented Toronto at trial to ask them about their decisions. He spent only 2 to 3 hours talking to Toronto at the prison. 2 to 3 hours to prepare an appeal that would determine whether a man lived or died. Bryant did not look for new evidence that might help Toronto. He did not argue that the trial lawyers had done a poor job. He raised only 5 issues, and all of them were based on what was already in the trial record. He charged about $12,000 for his work. This was only half of what the state normally paid for death penalty appeals. He did half the work for half the money. And a man's life hung in the balance. The state court rejected the appeal on February 3, 1999. Bryant's weak effort had failed. But the Yo876544W2 QC VBNM damage went deeper than just losing this one appeal. The next step was federal court. Toronto got new lawyers for this stage. These lawyers were better. They looked at the case closely and found many problems that should have been raised earlier. They found issues with Detective Wiginton's interrogation tactics. They found issues with evidence that was kept from the jury. They found issues with how poorly Toronto's trial lawyers had represented him. But there was a major problem. Under a law called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, federal courts can only review issues that were properly raised in state court first. Because Barry Bryant had failed to raise these issues, they were now locked out. The federal courts were not allowed to consider them. It did not matter that the issues were valid. It did not matter that they might have changed the outcome. Bryant had failed to raise them at the right time, so they could never be heard. Toronto was being punished for his lawyers' mistakes. Judge Joe Fish denied Toronto's federal appeal on August 17, 2001. Toronto asked a higher federal court, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, to review the case. They refused on February 26, 2002. Door after door was closing. Toronto's options were running out. The execution date was approaching. And the courts had decided they would not help him. As Toronto Patterson's execution date approached, his case attracted international attention. The execution of juvenile offenders was increasingly controversial worldwide. Most developed nations had abolished the practice decades earlier. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, ratified by every country in the world except the United States and Somalia, explicitly prohibited executing people for crimes committed as minors. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights also banned the practice, though the United States had filed a reservation when ratifying that treaty. On May 29, 2002, Attorney J. Gary Hart filed a petition with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. This body, part of the Organization of American States, reviews claims of human rights violations in member countries including the United States. The petition argued that executing Toronto would violate international law. It cited the jus cogens norm against executing juvenile offenders. It argued that the United States was bound by this norm regardless of its reservations to various treaties. On June 10, 2002, the Commission took action. They issued precautionary measures requesting that the United States take steps to preserve Toronto Patterson's life while they investigated the petition. This was not a binding order. The Commission did not have enforcement power over the United States, but it represented the formal position of an international human rights body. It represented the consensus of the Western Hemisphere that executing juvenile offenders was a human rights violation. The United States government and the state of Texas ignored the request. They proceeded with plans for execution as if the Commission had said nothing. The United States had a long history of disregarding international human rights bodies when their rulings conflicted with domestic law. Texas in particular was defiant about its use of the death penalty. On August 26, 2002, 2 days before the scheduled execution, the Commission reiterated their request. Again, they asked that Toronto's life be spared pending their investigation. Again, they were ignored. Other international voices joined the chorus. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Mary Robinson expressed deep concern about the pending execution. The European Union formally urged clemency through the Danish embassy, which held the rotating presidency of the EU at the time. Amnesty International, the world's largest human rights organization, opposed the execution and called on Texas to commute the sentence. The American Bar Association, which had formally adopted a position opposing the execution of juvenile offenders, added their voice to the calls for clemency. None of it mattered. Texas would proceed with the execution regardless of what the international community thought. On August 26, 2002, 2 days before the scheduled execution, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles considered Toronto Patterson's request for mercy. This 18-member board had the power to recommend that the governor change Toronto's death sentence to life in prison or delay the execution. Attorney J. Gary Hart filed a detailed petition laying out every reason to spare Toronto's life. The petition argued that there was still doubt about Toronto's guilt. It pointed to the alternative suspects who were never properly investigated. It highlighted the gunshot residue found on Ollie Brown Jr.'s hands and the fact that the Jamaican drug dealers Toronto named were real people. The petition also attacked the confession, detailing Detective Wiginton's aggressive tactics and pointing to the Michael Martinez case where Wiginton had forced an innocent man to confess. Hart argued that Toronto was only 17 when he committed the crime, and that his brain was not fully developed. He noted that almost every other country in the world had stopped executing juvenile offenders. The petition also documented how Barry Bryant's poor legal work had cost Toronto the chance to raise important issues in court. Finally, it cited international human rights bodies that had asked the United States to spare Toronto's life. The board rejected everything. They voted 17-0 against delaying the execution. They voted 16-1 against changing the death sentence to life in prison. Only one person on the entire board showed any willingness to let Toronto live. On August 28, 2002, the day Toronto was scheduled to die, his attorneys made one last desperate attempt. They asked the United States Supreme Court to stop the execution. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the court announced its decision. 6 justices voted to let the execution proceed. 3 justices disagreed. Justice John Paul Stevens wrote that the court should reconsider whether executing juvenile offenders was constitutional. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Justice Stephen Breyer agreed that the case deserved another look. These 3 justices could see what was coming. The practice of executing people for crimes they committed as teenagers was falling out of favor. It would soon be declared unconstitutional. But that day had not yet arrived. The Supreme Court refused to stop the execution. Toronto Patterson would die that evening. The news reached him in his cell at the Walls Unit in Huntsville. There would be no more appeals, no more delays, no more hope. In a few hours, the state of Texas would end his life. Toronto had one final request to make. When a condemned prisoner in Texas learns that all appeals have failed, prison officials ask what they want for their last meal. Toronto Patterson made his choices. He requested 6 pieces of crispy fried chicken, 4 jalapeno peppers, 4 buttered buttermilk biscuits, a chef salad with bacon bits, black olives, ham, and Italian dressing, 6 Sprites, and a white cake with white icing. It was a substantial meal for a man about to die. Prison officials prepared everything according to his specifications. It would be the last thing he ever ate. Toronto had spent 7 years on death row waiting for this day. 7 years in a small cell. 7 years of appeals and legal filings and hope slowly fading. Now all of that was over. He had hours left to live. He ate his final meal. He thought about his life. He thought about his family. He thought about the people he had killed. And he thought about the daughter he would never see again. On death row, Toronto had fathered a daughter. His girlfriend had been pregnant at the time of his arrest in June 1995. The child was born while he sat in the Dallas County Jail awaiting trial. For more than 6 years, Toronto had never been able to hold his daughter. He had never been able to hug her or kiss her. Prison rules and security kept them apart. He could see her only through thick glass during visits. He could speak to her only through a telephone. He could never touch her. In May 2002, 3 months before the execution, Toronto was allowed a brief visit with his daughter. She was 6 years old, the same age Jennifer Brewer had been when Toronto killed her. The painful irony was impossible to ignore. Toronto's daughter was the same age as one of his victims. The visit took place through glass, as always. He could see his little girl, but could not hold her. They talked through the phone. He studied her face, knowing he would never see her again. He later told people that he would give his life just to hug and kiss her once. That wish would never come true. At 6 p.m. on August 28, 2002, guards came to Toronto's cell. They escorted him to the death chamber at the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas. This small room had seen hundreds of executions. Now it would see one more. Toronto was strapped to a gurney. His arms were extended outward. Medical workers inserted IV lines into his veins. Through these tubes, 3 drugs would flow. The first would put him to sleep. The second would paralyze his muscles. The third would stop his heart. Witnesses gathered in the viewing room behind a glass window. Family members of Kimberly, Jennifer, and Ollie were there. They had waited 7 years for this moment. Representatives from the media were also present. They would report Toronto's final words to the world. The warden stood beside the gurney and asked Toronto if he had any last words. Toronto spoke his final statement. He said he was sorry for the pain he had caused his friends, family, and loved ones. He said he felt responsibility and guilt for the crime. But even at the end, even strapped to a gurney with death minutes away, he maintained that he should not die for a crime he did not commit. He had confessed to the murders years ago. He had given police detailed statements. Yet here, in his final moments, he still claimed innocence. He said he was sorry, but nothing could bring Kim, Ollie, and Gigi back. He used Jennifer's nickname, the name her family had called her. He prayed that his death would bring peace to his family and help unite them. He asked everyone for forgiveness. He said he felt no anger toward anyone. He said he was at peace with what was about to happen. Then he did something unexpected. He invited everyone to his funeral. He said they were all still family, even now, even after everything. His last words were for his mother, his Aunt Deidre, and all his loved ones. He told them he loved them. Then he turned to the warden and spoke 3 final words. "I am ready." The warden gave the signal. The drugs began to flow. Toronto's eyes closed. His breathing slowed. At 6:20 p.m., 20 minutes after the process began, a doctor examined him. Toronto Markkey Patterson was pronounced dead. He was 24 years old. He had been 17 when he killed Kimberly Brewer and her 2 children. Now he was gone. The state of Texas had carried out its sentence. Justice, or vengeance, had been served. Toronto Patterson was the 13th person Texas executed for crimes committed as a juvenile since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. He was the 21st such execution in the entire United States during that period. Of the 19 juvenile offenders executed nationwide since 1976, 11 were from Texas. The state led the nation in executing children by a wide margin. No other state came close to Texas's record of putting juvenile offenders to death. In 2002 alone, Texas executed 3 juvenile offenders. Napoleon Beasley died on May 28 for a carjacking murder in Tyler. He was 17 when he shot John Luddig in his driveway while stealing his car. T.J. Jones died on August 8 for another carjacking murder in Longview. He was also 17 at the time of his crime. Toronto Patterson died on August 28 for the triple murder in Dallas. All 3 were 17 years old when they committed their crimes. All 3 were black men. All 3 were from Texas. The state was executing juvenile offenders at a pace that no other jurisdiction in the developed world would tolerate. Toronto Patterson's victims remain dead. Kimberly Brewer never saw 26. She never watched her children grow up. She never got to see what they might have become. Jennifer Brewer never reached 2nd grade. She never learned to read fluently. She never went to middle school or high school. She never had a first crush or a best friend or a graduation. Ollie Brown Jr. never celebrated his 4th birthday. He never went to school at all. He never learned to ride a bike or throw a ball or do any of the things little boys do as they grow. Their lives were taken for wheel rims worth $2,000. If you found this documentary informative, please subscribe to No Way Out for more in-depth true crime coverage. Like, comment, and share to help us reach more viewers. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new documentary.